How many people here have been in this residence before? Anybody? How many have never been here? How many always wondered if you're ever going to get in here? Well, this house is, of course, the Russian ambassador's residence. It was built in 1910, called the Pullman House, built for, I guess, a descendant, maybe the daughter of one of the people who had the Pullman trains. And the Russian, or I guess the Soviet Union, bought it in 1913, and from that time on, it's been the residence of the ambassador. And we're very honored to be here this evening, and because the ambassador agreed to host this dinner. Ambassador Sergey Ivanovich Kislyak, who has been the ambassador to the United States since 2008, and he's had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service. Just briefly, for those who don't know his background, his parents are Ukrainian by birth, but he was born in Moscow, and he originally intended to be a nuclear physicist and actually went to the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute and graduated in 1970, and then went to work in the nuclear nuclear physics area and did that for a number of years. And then later, I think in 1974, he then went to work for the USSR School of Foreign Trade and got involved with the Foreign Ministry, graduated from there in 1977, and had a fairly meteoric career. He has served as, in the United States before, he was the first secretary and consulate here in the United States for the Russian embassy. He's also served as the second secretary of their UN delegation. He's also been the ambassador to NATO for Russia, and he's also been ambassador to Belgium from Russia. And before he took this job in 2008, he was the deputy foreign minister for Russia. He has served through a number of Russian leaders. We'll talk about that later. He is married. His wife and he live here. He has one daughter who lives in Moscow and one granddaughter. And I'm now my privilege to introduce the ambassador from Russia, who's going to make some opening remarks, and then we'll have a conversation. So, Ambassador Kislyak, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubenstein. And first of foremost, I'd like to welcome everybody to this beautiful house that we love so much and try to preserve exactly as it was originally built. You can be assured that all the chandeliers, all the decorations, the fireplaces are exactly the way they were built 104 years ago. We are proud to be able to enjoy it, and we also like when Americans come to share it with us. It's a real pleasure for me and a privilege to host the Economic Club, because I have been to many events that you invite us, all diplomats, to, and I have always enjoyed both the informative part of it and a sense of humor that is usually also present. And when I was trying to think what I have to say today, I was trying to define both components, serious information and something with a sense of humor. And since I'm going to talk about Russian-American relations, I have to confess the sense of humor has been out. It has been wasted. Because the quality of the relations today is very deplorable. And to be honest, it's not my first time in the States, and I lived here in the Cold War, and I worked there in Cold War. And when people ask me whether we have returned to the Cold War, I say no, because there is no ideological divide of the past. But at the same time, the quality of these relations today, in my view, is the worst after the end of the Cold War. We have never thought that we would come to that kind of relations where almost everything stopped. Most probably not many people know that we no longer have any bilateral consulting mechanisms. They are disbanded by a decision of American side. We do not have military-to-military contacts. We have suspended, not us, our American friends, a number of contacts that had been in place and rather important during even the Cold War. You would be surprised, I'm not going now to see my colleagues in the DOE, whereas in the past we had been working so much to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, where DOE people were so important partners for us. I even once received a note suggesting that NASA is not going to work with us. That was surprising, since at that time your astronaut was flying on Russian spacecraft to the Russian-American space station. But that's something that was corrected afterwards. But I'm trying to tell you what kind of state of affairs we have today. It's deplorable, unnecessary, and very much something that hinders the ability of both the United States and Russia to be working together on issues that are really serious. There is a question that I'm asked frequently, how we ended up with the situation where we are. Some say that it was Ukrainian events, some say that the current environment in the States around your elections, but in reality it was a little bit different. The worsening of relations, and I'm giving you certainly a Russian version of it, and most probably my American friends wouldn't agree with my explanation of things, but it's something we believe in. It started something in 2011, 2012, when Russia had elections. And when we saw significant interference by political people from the United States in judging as to how these elections passed, in encouraging the discontent by a number of opposition people in Russia. But it was something that is our internal affairs, and we could certainly live without being advised or told as to how we need to continue to live. That was, in my view, the beginning of electricity generation in Russian-American relations. Then we were joining WTO, and I have to be honest and thankful for the US government, because at the final stage the US government was helping us to become the members. That was important for Russia, because as a result we have been more integrated into world economy. But, and that is very American phenomenon, at least as we see it, we got a Magnitsky Law as a kind of condition by the Congress for American acceptance of Russian WTO membership. It's very difficult to explain people in Russia as to why it is the case, because prior to that we had the Jackson-Vanik amendment that had been introduced in the Soviet Union times by the Congress in order to pressure Russia on the issue of Jewish immigration. By the time of our discussions on WTO, all the Jews that wanted to go to Israel have left. All the Jews who were there being friends to us are returning to relatives, returning with money, returning with ideas. Russia and Israel are friends. We do not need to have a visa to go to Israel. And Israelis do not ask for visa when they come to us. But the Jackson-Vanik was still here. And in order to be able for us to join WTO, whereas American business would be able not to be discriminated on the Russian market, WTO, Jackson-Vanik had to be abandoned. But the Congress didn't agree to it, so they insisted that there need to be a replacement. Once I asked one of the member of the Congress, and why do you need it? And she said, we need a leverage. That was certainly another event in our relations that spoiled these relations, because Magnitsky Law If you want, at some point I can explain it in detail. It was offensive to Russian people. It generated a lot of opposition in Russia and certainly some actions to respond. Then, if you remember the Olympics in Russia and very unfriendly campaign here about it, including the LGBT rights, and it was all absolutely developing as a bubble on non-issue, because there is no oppression of LGBT community in Russia. There had been at the time either. By the way, nothing has changed in Russia. Do we hear a lot of criticism today as to what is the environment around the LGBT community in Russia? No, nothing has changed. The reason why all of this was happening was Olympics, and Russia was in the focus. Then Snowden affair, and it's something that we didn't invite on us. And Mr. Snowden was flying from Hong Kong to some place in Latin America just to see his passport revoked by the State Department when he was in flight to Moscow. So when he arrived to Sheremetyevo Airport in transit zone, he found himself unable to fly further because not a single airliner would pick him up on a board without valid passport. The US government insisted that we extradite him, but we do not have an extradition agreement with the United States because the United States never agreed to have one with us. So as a result of it, the US president decided to cancel a Russian-American summit meeting, and that was going even lower in our relations. Then the Ukrainian events. I wouldn't explain all the elements of this situation now, but if you ask me, I will. But what happened there, as far as we're concerned, there was a forceful overthrow of dutifully and legally elected government. The United States chose to support this process, chose to support those who were overthrowing the government with the help of the most nationalistic people, those who were chanting in the streets, if you find a Moskal, Moskal is denigrating Ukrainian for Russian, hung him on a tree. I'm not saying that it was something unusual for the country. It was because usual for those who were insisting on nationalistic change in Ukraine. Plus, you add to this a kind of fight between oligarchs for the in a power game in the country, and it resulted all of this in the events that went absolutely unlawful. You chose to support them, we didn't. And that's something that put us on the different sides of history. We think we are on the right side of history, and you are not. And certainly only history will tell, but I can tell you my view, and I know Ukraine, have a lot of connections with the country of my parents. It will change, because normal Ukrainian people are normal people, and some normalcy will return. But when today I see SS division's insignia on the young people's sleeves marching in the streets of Kyiv with torchlight and celebrating the anniversary of the birthday of one of the heads of SS division Galinche, and that was cooperating with the Nazi Germany, I cannot watch it idly. And when the Minister of Culture a couple of weeks ago spoke on national TV, Ukrainian national TV, and he was outlining the theory of his that Russians genetically are not able to adapt to Ukrainian culture, suggesting that simply do not belong here. But as a part of history of ours, we have so many families like mine in Russia who are of ethnic Ukrainian origin. We have millions of families like mine back in Ukraine who came from Russia. And that certainly created a lot of problems, and the government that came to power, they chose to fight their own people instead of talking to their people and try to find mutual accommodation. Then the question is why that kind of development is happening in our relations. My answer is very simple. The Cold War mentality. The Cold War is over for 25 years. But the moment we have differences, there is a tendency to fall in what in computer world people say fallback position. And the fallback is Cold War mentality. And one of my American friends told me that, you know, Sergey, for many Americans, even the name of your country hasn't changed. It was Russia in the Soviet Union times, and it's still Russia. So perception of what we are is somewhat different from what is occurring in real life. But Russia is a different country, not only geographically. It's a country with market economy, it's a country with a democracy, maybe not without things to be improved, but it's in existence in this shape only for 25 years. It's so young market economy. The world is changing, and the role of countries is changing, and our American friends must probably need to take a more serious look at the role of other countries, because sometimes you believe that U.S. being an exceptional country is entitled to be in the leadership of everything, and everybody else need to accept each and every wisdom that you share with us. With due respect, there are other exceptional countries, mine, Ukraine, you name it, anywhere in the world. The difference being that we are not trying to impose on others our exceptionalism. But the problem with the exceptionalism is that the moment you do not feel that your views are being accepted automatically, you feel that you need to exert pressure. And that's exactly what is happening in Russian-American relations, because instead of seeking for solutions, we saw introduction of sanctions against Russia. We have 4 cycles of sanctions against us for various reasons. Sometimes they were surprising. Sometimes they are causing a lot of questions among Russian business world as to whether one can trust in long-term dealings with our American friends, because you can see your assets to be arrested for things you have nothing to do with. Because the first round of sanctions, if you noticed, was targeted against those people who are considered in Washington being close to the president of Russian Federation. So I'll give you an example. Minister of Culture, of Education was under sanctions. Most probably he doesn't have assets in the United States to be arrested. He doesn't need your visa because he lives in Moscow. But he was sanctioned for being close to the president of Russia, because they know each other from younger years. The business is telling me now that these round of sanctions shows that you become very vulnerable being dependent on Americans. The other side of the story also is you are vulnerable if you trade in dollars, because American system allows the government of the United States to intercept, to arrest all the transactions, not only your assets here, if they are in dollars. And you see there is a new tendency among many countries to start trading in currencies other than dollars to protect themselves from that kind of policies. We certainly live in a real world and understand that the volume of dollars circulating in the world is huge, enormous. That certainly helps your economy. But there is a tendency, including in my country, in BRICS countries, and even with some Asian, very westernized economies, to trade in currencies other than dollar. Because people feel that once after we trusted the United States after the World War II to be the custodian, if you will, of the payment system. We saw in '72 when President Nixon decided to abandon one of the cornerstones of the system, the ability to exchange your paper dollar in gold. And without giving even advance notice, we learned that it was no longer your policy. Now with the sanctions with dollar, it's another signal that something develops in wrong direction. I will try to be a little bit shorter with the rest of my presentation. Having said all of this, I would like to make a couple of points. One, sanctions are not, Russian economy is developing better than even we expected. We have suffered significantly from the drop of prices for oil. We have suffered immensely from our own slowness in restructuring the economy, from the overdependence on oil and gas. And it was the major part of income for our budget. We are changing fast. We have adapted to this situation. Last year was the first when 60% of the income for the budget came from the sectors of economy other than oil and gas. That's the beginning. We are expanding reliance on high tech. Last year in the computer world, we have sold 7 billion worth of products to the world. It's not too much, but it's a beginning. We have excellent brains to be used. And with that kind of change, I think we will be changing the structure, diversifying the economy pretty fast. The sanctions also created some incentive for Russian business to grow. And they created some of the niches for the market that had been closed for them in the past. Agriculture is doing phenomenally well. I recently went to Moscow and my kids introduced me to a phenomenal cheese. I love cheeses. And it's a goat camembert, goat cheese camembert. And it's interesting that goat in Russia sounds koza, and the brand name's Cosa Nostra. I highly recommend when you are next time in Moscow. It's real good stuff. So what I'm suggesting is that we went through a difficult period. Now it's much better. We will see the growth in Russia for next year from 1.1 to 1.7%. IMF gives even better assessments. It's not unusual for developed economies now, even in Europe, to have the same type of economic growth expectations. It's not that far from a much more successful American economy because yours is about 2%. So we certainly can survive without working with the Americans. We can survive your sanctions. We have decided for ourselves that we are not going to walk around Washington with extended hand and begging for sanction removal. We do not negotiate sanctions, full stop. But at the same time, we keep all the doors open. And we certainly are very much interested in returning to normalcy. Normalcy that would allow us to move faster into the future together. Because the challenges that we face, you and us, are so similar. Look, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and one of the most dangerous phenomena, possibility of nexus between terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. The infectious diseases, the shortage of water, there are so many things that we can do much better together than on our own or if we work against each other. And I will tell you one recent example as to how it can be useful. The issue of chemical weapons in Syria. I know that you have your own debates as to the wisdom of your policy on this issue, but what is important? That when all of us were trying to define what needs to be done next about the issue, we decided to work together. We decided to help to remove chemical weapons from Syria. And just try to remember, it was done collectively. It was done in the middle of a war, in a war zone situation, because we were interested to work together, and we have been able to work together, and we have succeeded. Just try to imagine what would have happened if all these chemical stops would have fallen in the hands of Al-Qaeda or ISIL. So that's another example that how things need to be done instead of fighting each other politically and economically and even politically military, because the recent deployment of NATO forces, including the recent deployment of American brigade next to our border, certainly heightened the tension. We consider it to be a danger to Russian security. We are taking steps on our side of the border in order to be prepared for any eventualities. And I ask myself, do we need it after 25 years of the Cold War? And that's very disappointing. Now for the future. As I said, we keep the doors open. We are looking forward to learn more about the future policies of newly established administration in the United States. We have heard a number of statements that encourage us to think that the windows for cooperating are possible. If it is done on basis of mutual respect and taking into account mutual interests, I think we will be interested and available to work together. We are told that your new president is a very good negotiator. I would say that my president is also very tough and very good negotiator. But I believe in tough negotiators, because when you make a difficult deal, fully negotiating it, you have a good understanding at what you agreed on. It's very important that when agreement is reached, people deliver something that was missing, for example, in our recent interactions on Syria in the past. So if you ask me, do I look into the future with some optimism? I said, I don't know, but certainly I look into the future with some hope. Thank you very much indeed.
So for those people who want a transcript of what you've just heard, the NSA will be providing it tomorrow morning. I'm sure it can be delivered directly to your office. Do you have any doubt that the NSA is listening into what we're saying now?
Well, there are several subjects for any diplomats that we do not like to discuss.
Okay, you don't want to talk about that. Okay. But do you have a view that the discussions that you had, or supposedly had, with National Security Advisor Flynn, were you shocked to read that the NSA had intercepted that?
Shocked? No.
No, okay. So,
Disappointed? Yes. But there was nothing in those conversations that would be inappropriate, so I'm rather...
so in other words, he has said that all he was talking about was getting up, organizing a call with Putin and Trump, and he wasn't saying, as some people implied, he was telling you, we'll be easier on sanctions or something like that. There was no discussion to the sanctions, right?
Mr. Rubenstein, we have a policy of not commenting on our daily conversations with
Okay.
our interlocutors, because if everything that we discuss is going to be discussed then publicly who is going to be interested in talking.
Okay. Well, that's a fair point, but I always can try. So let's talk about, if we can, some of the subjects about your background first. I indicated in the introduction that you intended to be a nuclear engineer or physicist. What propelled you to get out of that business?
Well, there were a sequence of circumstances that were unexpected to me. I was working in one of the most prestigious nuclear lab in Russia. At that time, I was asked whether I would be willing to work for some time in the International Atomic Energy Agency, in the UN kind of environment, to work on non-proliferation, which I found at that time very interesting challenge. So I decided to try, and while I was preparing myself, the foreign ministry invited me, with my background, to work for a while in the ministry on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. That was phenomenally interesting time and interesting job for me. So I decided that I will try for a couple of years, and then I will decide what to do next. And I got stuck, and I never complained about it.
Okay. So at the time, you were working for the Soviet Union's foreign ministry. Is that correct? Were you shocked that ultimately the Soviet Union, as we knew it then, broke up, or did you think that it was inevitable at some point?
I thought it wasn't inevitable. I never thought that the Soviet Union will cease to exist. And it was certainly a significant shake-up for all of us, not only me. And if you ask me, was I disappointed? Yes. And I would say that I loved the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about some policies. I was talking about a country that was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, where we never thought as to who you are, Ukrainian, Russian, Jew, where you want to live. I remember traveling as a student in the Caucasus. We were invited to houses by local Greeks, by local Georgians, and nobody cared as to what you were. Currently, we have so many dividing lines and sometimes conflicts between people that certainly are very, very deplorable. But Russia certainly emerged as a very, very stable, democratic country that I love, and I feel very proud and comfortable to be a Russian citizen.
Now, you worked in the foreign ministry when Mr. Brezhnev was the head of the Soviet Union?
Yep.
And did you actually work with him or know him?
No,
you didn't know him. You were
I was
too
too young
junior.
for that.
Too junior. And did you get to know Mr. Gorbachev, or were you still very junior then?
Well, it's interesting. The first time I met personally Mr. Gorbachev was in the adjacent room here. I was working at the embassy doing arms control, and he came there in the late 80s, and there were a lot of negotiations. Among them, in the adjacent room, a lot of things that became part of the nuclear reductions agreements between us were negotiated in this historical building. Not all, but some. It was a fascinating time, and it was a fascinating job to work under his guidance. I saw him 3 years ago, I think. He visited me here in the same room.
Right.
We had a wonderful dinner with him.
So, Mr. Gorbachev is revered to some extent in the United States and reviled to some extent in Russia. Does that surprise you when you see how we seem to like him and he seems to be not that popular in Russia, if I'm correct?
Most probably you are correct, because many people in Russia believe that he started very important processes of liberating the country with perestroika, with glasnost, that is Russian equivalent of openness. The country has changed.
Right.
And it has changed enormously. But the problem is that he wasn't able to manage this change, this process, in a way that would keep the country intact.
So, some of you may have heard Mr. Gorbachev. I didn't really know him. I only met him once, but he was a very impressive, very smart person. And
Yes. Yes,
one
still
time
is.
he went to the Kennedy School at Harvard after he had completed his time as head of the Soviet Union, and a student asked him in the forum they have there, well, Mr. Gorbachev, how would the world have been different if in November of 1963 Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated rather than John Kennedy? And without missing a beat, he said, well, of course, how can anybody predict how history would have gone differently and so forth? I can't really say. Well, one thing I can say for certain is that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So, it was a pretty quick wit, I thought. Anyway, so, now...
That's why I like economic club so much.
Right. Okay. So, let me ask you today, when you have your job today as ambassador is to get to know the business community and the diplomatic community, and typically on a typical day you're making speeches. What is a typical day for the ambassador from Russia?
I usually wake up in the morning.
Okay. All right.
I go to the news. I go to the embassy, news. Talk to people. I have appointments almost on a daily basis. I talk, I read, I write. And in the end of the day, I get together with all my staff and we try to summarize where we are. And for us, it's very unusual, and many Western embassies do not do that. But because of the difference in time, 8 hours, if it is an important issue here that we want to understand and help Moscow to have a full picture of, we need to report the same day. And that means we work long hours.
I see. So the United States government took away, in effect, access to your Eastern Shore retreat.
Yes.
Now that was, and a number of diplomats were asked to leave the country. But do you have access to that Eastern Shore retreat any longer yourself?
Not yet. But it's absolutely against the international norms, international law, because it was a diplomatic, and still is, a diplomatic property. And the Vienna Convention and all the bilateral agreements, you cannot violate the diplomatic status of Russian property. And we are working on legal aspects of it. We'll see what can be done. And I do not believe that situation is going to be lasting indefinitely, because U.S. are violating their commitments.
Now you have an interest in culture, and you go to the Kennedy Center from time to time. You go to opera in New York. When you want to travel around the United States, do you have a massive phalanx of bodyguards, or how do you get to New York, or how do you transport yourself?
No, we travel modest, and I feel rather safe in the United States. Sometimes, though, when I come to some remote places, maybe not that remote, in Dallas, for example, the host organization, they provide close protection that we had never asked for.
Okay.
But they felt that it might be appropriate, and we didn't object, especially taking into account that people who worked with us ensuring security were so charming.
So it has been rumored in the papers that President Trump and President Putin are going to have a meeting in Reykjavik. Do you know anything about that?
No?
No. Okay.
No, I mean it. It's not in the works. I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of months, weeks, I don't know, that would be a good venue to choose for a first meeting. If you ask me, do we need a meeting? I think yes. But the problem is that just a meeting to meet each other is certainly important, but not for the sizes and importance of the countries like ours. It has to be something that would help to advance our relations.
Right.
And that means, in turn, it has to be thought through and maybe at least somewhat better prepared.
So obviously you know Mr. Putin very well.
I do.
And so the United States, we don't know as much about him as obviously you do, but does he speak English or understand English or
He
not?
does. He does. But he speaks German absolutely fluently, and English is something that he learned afterwards. And he easily communicates, he understands everything. But when it comes to official negotiations, because those are official conversations, you have to be very, very careful with the wording.
So he is obviously a fitness expert, or seems to be, likes to ride around, bare-chested on his horse and things like that. Is that because he's just really likes to, show virility as a great athlete, or why is he so interested in fitness? Not that it's bad to be fit, but
Mr. Putin has a very healthy lifestyle. He has been a sportsman all his life. He's black belt in judo. He now plays hockey in what we call nightly hockey league. He has invested so much of his personal time to bring the understanding of importance of healthy lifestyle to the young generation of Russians. It's increasingly important, especially on the backdrop of the narcotics flows in the streets, drunkenness among the young generation, and it works. He is kind of a role model in this respect. The Olympics that were held in Sochi were enormously important event in overall state effort to advance healthy lifestyle. And we see more and more kids going to stadiums, playing games, and it's something that is enormously important. And he attaches a lot of importance to that. And being very well fit, he keeps in shape himself.
okay. So on the issue you mentioned earlier about Ukraine, and which led to some sanctions, is it your view that the sanctions that have been imposed by the United States and Europe, the Europeans are less interested in keeping the sanctions, or you think they are basically in lockstep with the United States?
It depends on the Europeans, because there are Europeans and there are Europeans. There is EU that kind of creates a discipline on a collective basis. With EU, we have significantly more important economic relations than with the United States. I will give you some numbers. With the US, in the best year, that was, I think, 2012, the overall volume of trade both ways between us and EU was less than $40 billion a year, according to American statistics. 29 billion according to Russian statistics. Whichever statistic you choose, it's less than 1% of American foreign trade. I remember 2 years ago, in the first trimester, you lost 2% of your foreign trade. Did anybody notice it? And here we have less than 1%. That kind of trade doesn't put the United States on the top list of important economic partners for Russia either. So difficulties in economic relations with you, they are certainly deplorable, but they are not that important for the overall economy. Whereas with Europe, the situation is quite different. I might be a little bit mistaken, but in the ballpark, I think our trade with EU is about $500 billion a year. With Germany, 90. With Italy, significantly more than with the United States. So EU as an entity for us is a really important partner. We have others like China, India, many others, but Europe, even because of geographical closeness, is by far the biggest and convenient partner for us. So for us, it's certainly important what the Europeans will be doing. But like here in the States, we are not begging for removal of sanctions. It's your decision. Europeans are suffering, by the way, much more than you. I saw yesterday some figures suggesting that they have lost $61 billion as lost revenue. They are losing jobs, 300,000, I think, only in Germany. I'm not sure I'm fully aware of the exact numbers, but we are talking about significant numbers. When it comes to Russia, certainly it also didn't help, and especially on the backdrop of the oil prices reduction that affected our economy mostly. The sanctions added, I saw different assessments by economic specialists, from 5 to 10% of our difficulties, whatever you define it, however you define it.
So what about Crimea? Crimea, if Ukraine were somehow resolved, do you think that Crimea will always remain as part of Russia now, that is unlikely to change?
It was a decision by the Crimean people to become once again part of Russia. We have embraced them. They're going to be Russians.
And in Syria, in the Middle East, do you see any resolution of Syria in the near term?
Depends on how you define near and what do you define solution, because it's a huge conflict. We saw so many factors interacting there negatively. We have the government of Syria that is protecting the survival of the state. We have Al-Qaeda operating against anybody and with the goal of taking over. We have ISIL that is trying to build a holy caliphate, and Syria is only part of the whole design, because the holy caliphate, as far as I understand it, it's something that they had in 630. That is Northern Africa, all the Middle East, part of Russia, and part of Spain and Turkey. And it's certainly a huge danger. All of these factors are fighting sometimes each other. There are so many different fights to manage. We have been trying, even with the previous administration of the United States, to find a common policy, because neither you nor us can do the thing together. Right. On our own, we need to do it together. And the whole notion of solution for the cessation of violence was that we agree that those who decide to stop shooting at each other will be eligible for protection against any action by the government or by Russian Air Force. And those who will be continuing to support and being part of Al-Qaeda or ISIL will be taken care of together by you and us. But for that, you had to delineate what Americans call legitimate opposition from Al-Qaeda. And we thought that we had an agreement on that, but our American friends never delivered.
So let me ask you, now, you have an accent that's a little different when you speak English than many Russians with their English accent. How come you have slightly different accent? Did you learn English outside of Russia somewhere, or you speak?
Most probably I've been too long in the States.
Right, too long in the States, okay. And in the United States, there's obviously some resentment against very wealthy people by people who are not so wealthy and so forth. In Russia, there's a lot of oligarchs, so-called. Is there resentment by the average Russian? These individuals made so much money relatively quickly, or there's no resentment?
The term resentment, I think, doesn't reflect the nature of this relationship. Certainly the gap between those who possess enormous capitals and those who barely make ends meet is huge. And that's a social, if not tension, but dissatisfaction, right. The source of dissatisfaction for many. I'm not suggesting that we are approaching what Lenin called a revolutionary situation right. now. And I think what we see happening, and it's new to us, something that you here in the States have developed long ago, and you, Mr. Rubenstein, is known to be part of it. The Russian oligarchs are very new to the notion of charity, of sharing with the state, sharing with the people. It's developing pretty fast. but still it's a beginning. But by and large, people prefer to joke about oligarchs and the Nouveau Riche, and there are thousands of wonderful jokes. And what I like about our Nouveau Riche, they like the jokes and trade between them and ourselves.
Okay. So you've been ambassador since 2008, as I mentioned, but probably you haven't had as much public attention in the United States as you have in the last month or two. Because of all the attention, did you get criticized by people in Russia for agreeing to host this dinner? Did somebody say maybe you shouldn't do this, you don't need any more attention, or nobody even paid attention to this dinner?
To be honest, I even never thought as to how people will regard our dinner. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm so glad that you came. I'm so glad that I have a chance to explain ourselves. And I think that it's very important that we have a chance to tell what we are. And I always repeat, that is equally important to explain to people what we are not. Because there are so many issues that are untruths being circulated about Russia, Russia being vilified, and it's certainly, to be diplomatic, disappointing.
So if you were trying to develop some tourism for Moscow and you had a chance to talk to people here, people might be listening from NSA or anybody else, what would you say would be the best reason somebody should go visit Moscow or St. Petersburg? What is the appeal of going there?
First, it's very important to go there for people who had never been in Russia, just to learn that Russians are normal people. Second, they are not only normal, they're very similar to Americans in character, in values, in lifestyle. They are dynamic, we are dynamic, self-reliant. I have spoken to many Americans who had visited Russia. All of them enjoyed being there, except for one thing, especially in Moscow, it's traffic jams. It's awful. Otherwise, Moscow is phenomenally interesting. The best restaurant culture in Europe is in Moscow. The best cultural life in Europe is in Moscow. We have, since both of us love music, I will tell you, we have 4 opera houses permanently operating. One of them, Bolshoi, has 2 stages operating simultaneously, 3 ballet companies, 6 symphony orchestra, countless theaters. So cultural life in Moscow is staggeringly interesting. Interesting museums, however, Hermitage in St. Petersburg.
Do you have as good a metro system as we do, or not so much?
We have, most probably in Moscow, especially the central old part of it, the best underground system in the world, because each and every station is like a palace, similar to this one.
Right. So what is the greatest pleasure of being ambassador from Russia to the United States? What is the greatest pleasure, and what's the greatest aggravation, other than interviews like this?
It's a part of pleasure. It's certainly a sense of disappointment when you think about the state of relations that we are in now. When I came here in 2008, it wasn't an easy period either, because it was just immediately after the Georgian events when the criminal president of Georgia attacked people in South Ossetia in the middle of the night. And we had disagreements then. I remember I came here, and by the time I knew almost everybody in the government, and they were personally very welcoming and very professional in discussing issues. So you had elections, we had new administration of Mr. Obama, and we had the feeling that we can try to build and succeed in it, something reliable, predictable, and taking into account mutual interest on an equal basis. And now, 8 years afterwards, this is the biggest disappointment that I have. In terms of the best pleasure, I love traveling to the United States. I love talking to people outside of the Beltway, because there you are not talking to professionals, you're talking to normal people.
Right.
And they consider you to be.
And you can
more
travel anywhere you want. You have no restrictions?
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, hopefully there won't be any after this interview. Okay. Well, Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you very much for your hospitality and for a very interesting conversation. And we have a small, just to remind you of this, dinner. So I want to thank you very much, and I hope everybody had an enjoyable evening and seen this extraordinary house. And Mr. Ambassador, the best of luck to you in all your endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to us. And I hope it's not the last time we meet.